Welcome to You Have My Sword, and today we are talking about the short kings of Middle-earth, dwarves. I'll give you a breakdown of how dwarves came to be in Tolkien's Middle-earth, so let's talk about it. Dwarves were a race of Middle-earth, also known as the Khazad in their own tongue, or Kasari or Naugrim, meaning stunted people. They were also known as Gonhiram, or the Masters of Stone. You may be like, stunted people? That's fucked up. And yes, it is and it was. But let's go to the very beginning to shed some light on how this drag came to be. So the dwarves were made by Aule, whom they themselves called Mahal, meaning maker. Now, Aule was unwilling to await the coming of the children of Ilúvatar. He became incredibly impatient and desired to have someone to teach his lore and crafts. Therefore, he made the first 7 fathers of the dwarves in secret in a hall under the mountains of Middle-earth. So, Aule, being a god, can technically create life, but without the flame of Ilúvatar, these creations are essentially abominations. When Aule created the dwarves, he had only a vague idea of what the children of Ilúvatar should look like. Because of the threat of Morgoth over the world, Aule made them very strong both in body and character. Dwarves were a short, stocky race, a little taller than hobbits, but much broader and heavier. Most dwarves had thick, luxurious beards in which they took great pride and often forked or braided them and tucked them into their belts. So, due to Aule's eagerness to create life, no matter how well-intentioned, he ended up creating life that was not quite life. While they physically resembled dwarves, they mentally were not as cognizant as they should have been, because he did not have the flame to grant proper life. After being reprimanded by Ilúvatar for creating them and realizing his error, Aule offered Ilúvatar his own creations to do with as he would, including their destruction. Even as the offer was made, Ilúvatar accepted and gave the dwarves a life of their own. So instead of euthanizing these abominations, Ilúvatar granted them life. So when Aule picked up a great hammer to smite the 7 fathers and destroy his presumptuous creations, they cowered in fear and begged for mercy. Ilúvatar willed that the dwarves would not emerge before the firstborn, which were the elves, the first children of Ilúvatar. And so he decreed that the 7 fathers should sleep underground and come forth after the firstborn had awakened. Okay, so now let's talk about the year of the trees and the first age. About a century after the elves awoke, the 7 fathers of the dwarves were aroused. Of them, only the name of one is known, and that is Durin, who was called the Deathless. Each of the 7 fathers became a king of his own clan, and each built his own great hall. 3 major holds are known to have been built in this period. Belegost and Nogrod were built in the Blue Mountains, and the dwarves of those holds formed alliances with the Noldor elves and fought in their wars. Durin, on the other hand, wandered into a vale in the Misty Mountains, which he named Azanulzabar. In a still pool in that vale, he saw a reflection of himself with a crown of 7 stars. Ever after, the constellation of stars that the elves called Valakira was called by the dwarves Durin's crown, and it could be seen reflected in the water at any time of day, though only Durin could see his own reflection. Durin named this lake Keled Zaram and proceeded to build his great halls of Khazad-dûm within the mountains above. In the first age, the dwarves made alliances with the elves, and both prospered from trade. Dwarves from Belegost invented the famous dwarf mail of linked rings and fashioned the finest steel the world had ever seen. They also constructed the Hall of Thingol and Menegroth and were rewarded with the pearl Nymphalos. For context, Pearls were especially valuable to the dwarves as they were not fond of the sea and had no means of acquiring them except through trade. Now, for context, Nymphalos was said to have been the size of a dove's egg. It was originally given to Thingol by Curating, the shipwright. It was found by the Philothrim of the Isle of Balar, so this gesture was a great honor to the dwarves, as this pearl was essentially an heirloom. Dwarves fought alongside elves and men and participated in some of the major battles of the First Age, including the First Battle of Beleriand and the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, in which the dwarves of Belagos won great renown for being the only ones able to stand against the dragon Glaurung. For, and I quote, "It was their custom, moreover, to wear great masks in battle, hideous to look upon, which set them good steed against dragons, and besides, they were naturally able to resist fire better than elves or men." Absolute king shit. In that battle, Azagal, the lord of Belagos, was killed by Glaurung, who crawled over him. Before dying, the dwarf stabbed at the dragon's belly, and I quote, "pricked him so deep that he fled back to Angbad." Glaurung was easily one of the scariest dragons in Middle-earth, and certainly one of the coolest looking. Anyways, the dwarves of Nogrod were famous for their craftsmanship of their weapons. Most notable amongst their smiths was Telkar. Dwarves from Nogrod crafted the necklace known as Naglamir, and Thingol requested dwarven smiths from Nogrod to set a silmaril into that necklace. Thus were united the greatest works of elves and dwarves. Isn't that great? I love to see everyone getting along so much. Now, unfortunately, those dwarf smiths were driven mad by gold lust and murdered Thingol, stealing the necklace and the stone, igniting the bitter rivalry between dwarves and elves that would rage until the end of the Third Age. I'm sure many of you earlier were like, I thought dwarves and elves didn't get along, and here we've landed on why. But it's important to know this was not always the case. But this beef is justified and runs deep. So let's talk more about that. The elves of Doriath pursued the smiths to their deaths and reclaimed Naglamir. But two of the slayers of Thingol escaped from this ass beating and went back to Nogrod to tell how dwarves were being slain by command of the elven king, who was trying to cheat them of their reward. The dwarves of Nogrod lamented the deaths of their homies and their great craftsmen and sat down to plot their revenge. Though the dwarves of Belagos tried to dissuade them from their purpose, the dwarves of Nogrod invaded Doriath. After a hard battle in the Thousand Caves, the dwarves of Nogrod were victorious and took Naglamir and the Silmaril. On their return journey to the Blue Mountains, however, the dwarves of Nogrod were assailed by a company that included Beren, his son Dior, and many green elves of Assyrian. Many of the dwarves were slain, and Beren himself slew the lord of Nogrod and wrested from him the necklace Naglamir. Some of the dwarves escaped this battle, but they were ambushed in the slopes beneath Mount Dolmed by the Shepherds of the Trees, which is a fancy term for Ents. So, needless to say, elves got shooters all around Middle-earth, and it is a hard lesson that the dwarves learned here. Some stories from the First Age tell of petty dwarves, who were called the Nogiath Niben. Those dwarves had been exiled from their homes during the Peace of Arda and were the first dwarves to enter Beleriand. They first inhabited and carved out the caverns of Narog, which is later overtaken by Finrod and renamed Nargothrond. The last of the petty dwarves were Mim and his two sons, who lived at Amon Rud. Mim aided Turin in his adventures, but subsequently betrayed him to the orcs. We will go in depth on that story in its own episode for sure. Now, let's jump into the Second Age. Now that we have context of how dwarves came to be and how their historic beef with the elves started, let's get into the Second Age. So after the First Age, most accounts of dwarves concern those of the line of Durin, who are commonly called Durin's folk or Longbeards. You'll be glad to know that Durin enjoyed a very long life and lived through most of the First Age. Occasionally, in the following ages, a dwarf was born of this line that so resembled Durin that he was considered to be Durin reborn. Prophecy told that Durin would be reborn 7 times, and that the coming of Durin VII would mark the decline of the dwarves. Durin II was born in the Second Age. It is untold exactly when, but he was in power when the smith Narvi built the west gate of Khazad-dûm in the year 750. His reign was an era of great prosperity in which the halls of Khazad-dûm were greatly expanded and the Neldoran elves of Lindon moved into Eregion to trade with the dwarves for mithril. Population boomed because many refugees from Belagos and Nograd, which were destroyed at the end of the First Age, moved to Khazad-dûm. Now, Durin III was in power around the year 1600 of the Second Age. He was gifted— oh my god, dude. You literally are going to sleep all day, and the minute I sit down to record, you want to come through and scream at me? Okay, come up here. Come on, co-host. You're late. You're late for work. What do you have to say about dwarves? That's it? Okay. Okay, where were we? Now that my co-host is here. Yes, okay. So, now, Durin III was in power around the year 1600 of the Second Age. He was gifted with the 7th and most powerful of the Dwarven Rings of Power. It was the elven smith Celebrimbor and not Sauron who gave him this ring. The Rings of Power did not have the effects that Sauron had intended, possibly because Aule had made the dwarves especially resistant to evil and domination. The only apparent effect of the Dwarven Rings was that the dwarves became more greedy with gold lust, but they were not turned into wraiths like men. Sauron tried to recover the rings, and 2 he did reclaim fairly soon, and 4 ended up in dragon hordes, possibly consumed by dragonfire. Sauron did not reclaim the Ring of Durin until the year 2845 of the Third Age, when he captured Thrain II. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought assertively against Sauron. In fact, dwarves thought Sauron was a laughable bitch. Let's jump into the Third Age, where a lot of cool stuff happens. So, in 1980 of the Third Age, after centuries of greedy digging for mithril and other minerals, the dwarves woke a Balrog that was sleeping in the pits of the Misty Mountains since the First Age. The dwarves fled Khazad-dûm, from which then on was called Moria, which means Black Pit. Most of Durin's folk left for the Grey Mountains in the north, while some followed the new king, Thrain, who briefly went to Erebor. For more than 300 years, the dwarves of the Grey Mountains prospered until the dragons in the far north started to gain strength. Some fled to the Iron Hills, while most followed the new king Thror to Erebor to start a new kingdom under the mountain. There, they prospered for over 200 years until the dragon Benedict Cumberbatch descended in Third Age 2770. The king and his company went into exile, while most of the survivors went to the Iron Hills. Durin's folk settled in Dunland, and King Thror traveled north to Moria, where he was killed by the goblin king Azog. Thror's son, Thrain III, who had received the last of the 7 rings from his father before his departure, summoned all the houses of dwarves to war. Thus began the War of Dwarves and Orcs, in which the dwarves destroyed all the goblin strongholds in the Misty Mountains, culminating to the great battle of Azal-Nulbazar, where all the dwarven clans united. The goblin hosts issuing from Moria were strong and relentless until the arrival of fresh dwarves of the Iron Hills arrived. The battle ended with a victory for the dwarves, but at a great cost. The dwarven clans, however, were unwilling to repopulate Moria. Thrain, therefore, came to the Blue Mountains and established his realm there. Our boy Gandalf was instrumental into helping Thrain's son Thorin in reclaiming the kingdom of Erebor. Thorin gathered around him 12 dwarves, mostly from his own line, and was joined by Gandalf and Bilbo Baggins. Thus begins the story, as we know, of The Hobbit. The quest of Erebor ended with the death of Benedict Cumberbatch. After a quarrel with the men and elves over the unguarded hoard, the dwarves, assisted by those from the Iron Hills, united with the men and elves to fight the attacking goblins and wargs in what was called the Battle of the Five Armies, where Thorin was ultimately killed. Gimli joined the Fellowship of the Ring as a representative of the dwarves and befriended Legolas during the War of the Ring. After the battle at Pelennor Fields, a force of Longbeards and Men of Dale held the Lonely Mountain in a similar siege against an army of Easterlings who had taken all of the Bran's lands, leaving only his capital city of Dale. The dwarves and Men of Dale stood for 3 days against the Easterlings, and once the news of Sauron's death spread to the Lonely Mountain, the Easterlings retreated. Fourth Age. Okay, we rarely get into the Fourth Age, but let's talk about it. During the Fourth Age, which began after the destruction of Mordor and Sauron, dwarves and men reforged their friendship. Dain was killed during the War of the Ring and was succeeded by his son Thorin III Stonehelm, who ruled well into the Fourth Age. During this time, dwarves from the Lonely Mountain helped rebuild cities in Gondor and the fortress of the Hornburg, and some went to the newly established dwarven realm of the Glittering Caves, where Gimli was lord. The kingdom of the Lonely Mountain apparently continued to prosper throughout the Fourth Age. Subsequently, Gimli went on many undocumented travels with his friend Legolas. It was rumored that in the Fourth Age 120, Gimli and Legolas boarded a ship that sailed down the river Anduin and then sailed to Valinor. Gimli was, thus, the only dwarf to ever be permitted to cross to the Undying Lands. Now, Durin the Seventh retook Moria and brought Khazad-dûm back to its original splendor, and the Longbeards lived there until he, and I quote, "world grew old and the days of Durin's race ended," which feels bittersweet to say the least. So it looks like that prophecy of the dwarves kind of fizzling out once Durin the Seventh came around was accurate. So it is sad to think that the dwarves fought so hard to reclaim their strongholds and only for their race to essentially fizzle out. So let's talk a little bit about the nuances of dwarves themselves. Dwarves favored simple, durable clothing, colored hoods and heavy cloaks for traveling, and belts of gold or silver. For battle, their soldiers would have elaborately crafted armor and helmets bearing various angles and styles that were trademarks of dwarven crafting. Their armor was masked with symbols that were described as hideous to look upon. Essentially, dwarves wanted to make a scene at any battle they showed up at. Dwarven women were alike in manner, voice, and appearance to their menfolk. They were few in numbers, less than a third of all dwarf kind, and they were seldom seen outside their own halls, often not venturing far due to their duties as caretakers and crafters in dwarven society. They typically only traveled when in great need, and they usually dressed similarly to dwarf men. This often led other folk to believe there were no women among the dwarves, that dwarves grew from stone when created. Few female dwarven warriors were known, but some tales say that female dwarves were as fierce as their male counterparts, especially in protecting their families and offspring. Dwarves were usually monogamous, and fewer than 1/3 of dwarven men took a wife, the rest busying themselves with their crafts. Okay, let's talk a little bit about dwarven physiology. Dwarves were a proud and stern race and were made to be sturdy to resist the dangers of their time. They were physically very strong, had great endurance, especially in the ability to resist heat and cold, and they made light of heavy burdens. Dwarves lived longer than men, often up to 250 years. Dwarves had the ability to learn new artisanal skills quickly, especially those dealing with metal or stone. Dwarves were typically stubborn, secretive, and fiercely loyal to friends and family. They treat and care for each other, even strangers among their kind, like family. Can somebody please make a Fast and Furious 9 Dwarven family crossover meme for me, please? Thank you. Okay. Where am I? They cared greatly about mining, crafting, gold, and gems, their acquisition of which often fueled the envy of elves. Dwarves were easily offended by rude comments and had a propensity to hold long-lasting grudges. Dwarves were often seen as greedy, but their nature gave them resistance to many external influences, including to the evil of the rings of power that were given to them. Whereas the men who owned the 9 rings were corrupted and became Nazgul, the dwarves were unaffected, save by an increase, again, of gold lust and their hatred for anything that stood between them and what they perceived as their treasure. Dwarves were taught special skills by the Vala Aule and spent most of their time crafting, smithing, and mining in their massive underground cities. The dwarves were some of the greatest miners ever to exist in Middle-earth. The dwarves dug immense halls under mountains where they built their cities. Dwarven miners dug for precious minerals such as gold, iron, copper, and silver from all over the mountains in Middle-earth, though the dwarves considered coal mining degrading. In ancient times, the dwarves found mithril in the mines of Khazad-dûm. While mining beneath the lonely mountains, they discovered the Arkenstone at the heart of the mountain, and this is why the Arkenstone was so precious to them. They were also capable masons and smiths. Dwarven smithing skills were said to be rivaled only by those of the elves, and their masonry creations were bested by no one. The skill of the dwarves was unmatched. They crafted objects of great beauty out of diamond, emerald, ruby, and sapphire. Everything Dwarven was beautifully crafted and intricate. They crafted many famed weapons, armors, and items of art and beauty, among them being Narsil, the sword of Elendil, the dragon helm of Dorlomin, and the necklace Noglamir. Dwarven armies were vast and powerful, and possessed vast legions of soldiers, cavalry, and siege weapons, and their soldiers were equipped with powerful weapons, armors, and tools for battle. Many different weapons were utilized by their soldiers, such as swords, axes, throwing knives, and my favorite, warhammers. Dwarves favored chainmail and other metallic armor, the most expensive and precious of which was ringmail made of mithril. A vest of mithril was given to Bilbo by Thorin before the Battle of the Five Armies. It was worn during the battle and later protected his nephew Frodo throughout his quest. Gandalf said that this small coat was worth more than the whole of the Shire combined. Dwarves also had a knack for starting a fire almost anywhere out of almost anything. Although they knew how, dwarves did not farm or herd very often, as they preferred to spend their time underground mining and crafting. They rather trade crafted items with men and elves in exchange for food. They were on some meal delivery service shit, and I love that for them. They built many famed halls, including the Lonely Mountain, Belagos, Nograd, Khazad-dûm, the Halls of Thranduil, and Menegroth. The dwarves also reforged the gates of Minas Tirith and rebuilt the walls of Helm's Deep after the War of the Ring. Their cities appear to be constructed just under mountains or mountain ranges. Dwarven miners would excavate into the mountains to create an entrance and then dig through and under the mountain to create the groundwork for their cities. Dwarven cities were absolutely massive and very expensive, reaching the far depths of the earth. Dwarves continued to mine in their cities to expand them and discover more resources like precious metals and minerals. The beauty of the dwarves' cities was legendary. One stronghold, Erebor, located in the Lonely Mountains, had its wealth coming from precious gems hewn from rock and in great seams of gold running like rivers through stone. Language. Let's talk about the Dwarven language. So the Dwarven language was created by Aule when he created the dwarves themselves and called it Khuzdul, which simply meant Dwarvish. The language was harsh sounding and sounded strange to other peoples. No person who was not a dwarf was permitted to learn any of its words, for it was guarded with immense jealousy. When around other races, the dwarves seldom spoke in Khazdu. Certainly in the First Age, when they first made contact with the elves, the only tongue in Valyrian would have been Sindarin, as the Noldor had not yet returned from Amon. As a logical consequence, Sindarin was a language used by the dwarves. In fact, they were so impressed by the elvish runes for writing Sindarin that they adopted them for use in their own tongue. So, the Dwarven writing system. The dwarves use Angerthos, a runic writing system based on the elvish runes. There were different variations of Angerthos, which varied by each dwarven clan. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm had their own variation and introduced a number of unsystemic changes in the system. The dwarves of Erebor also used a further modification of the system, which was known as the Mode of Erebor. The Mode of Erebor was notably exemplified in the Book of Marzabul. I've mentioned this book a few times now, I think, and it's a book of records kept in Moria. We actually see them discover this book in the films, if you remember. Let's talk a little bit about Dwarven music. Many songs were sung in the halls of the dwarves. One very notable song was Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold, which fucking slaps. It's also known as the Song of the Lonely Mountain and commonly referred to by fans as simply the Dwarf Song. Another song sung in Dwarven culture was the Song of Durin, which told of the history of Khazad-dûm and honored Durin, first leader of the Durin's folk. I've talked about this roughly 100 times, but like the 1970s animated Hobbit film is a beautiful freak show, but the best part about it is the soundtrack full of Dwarven tunes. Do yourself a favor and listen to these bangers at any cost. Find them. I think they're on Spotify. Check them out. It's so good. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about wicked dwarves. Of the races of Arda, dwarves were the most resistant to corruption and influence of Morgoth and later of Sauron. The 7 rings of power of the dwarves did not turn them evil, but it did amplify their greed and their lust for gold, as we've talked about. It is said that very few willfully served the side of darkness. The Hobbit refers to these as wicked dwarves. Of the 7 houses, few fought on either side during the last alliance at the end of the Second Age, and none from the House of Durin ever fought on the side of evil. However, in times of war, dwarves often refused to ally themselves with elves or men, choosing to remain neutral or oblivious to the clashes between good and evil. During the early parts of the Third Age, it is known that in some places wicked dwarves had made alliances with the goblins and orcs. It is suggested by Tolkien in some of his notes that the dwarves that turned to wickedness most likely came from the far eastern mansions, and perhaps some of the nearer ones too, and became under the shadow of Morgoth and finally turned to evil. It is, however, unclear if these refer to dwarves beyond Iron Hills, which is the most eastern known stronghold of the dwarves. Because dwarves were not evil by nature, few ever served the enemy of their own free will. In some of Tolkien's earliest writings, the dwarven race as a whole was portrayed as an evil creation of Melkor, but Tolkien's ideas evolved as he continued to write about the dwarves as he became incredibly endeared to them and viewed them as a foundation of Middle-earth. Before we wrap up, let's talk about dwarf names real quick. Okay. Dwarves would, as a rule, not tell people of other races their real names, but take names in Westron instead and keep their real names secret. Not even on their tombs would they inscribe their real names. Many Dwarven names in the works of Tolkien are taken from the poetic Viking prophecies, often referred to as the Poetic Edda or Voluspa. A significant part of the prophecy describes the pagan worldview of the Vikings, and in that part can be found the Count of Dwarves, which is mostly a list of names. All the dwarf names from The Hobbit are taken from that source, as well as the name of Gandalf. Some other names, such as Gimli, meaning shelter from fire, and Harlan, are taken from the Icelandic language, but not from the Voluspa. Only a few dwarves in the works of Tolkien have original names in Khuzdul, which includes Azaghal and Telkar. So, interesting little tidbit. A lot of people wonder if Tolkien drew any inspiration from Norse mythology in regard to the dwarves, and the answer is yes, he sure did, especially in regard to the names. Okay, so the good news is this episode is finally over. I know it was a long one, and we usually do quick little deep dives, but I wanted to end with something meatier for you guys. And when I say end, I mean that at 15 episodes, this is the end of season 1. How cool is that? Honestly, 15 episodes isn't a lot, but it feels like a huge triumph for me since working on a solo podcast is incredibly tough. It's especially in conjunction to the million other things I do all day. But don't worry, I will be back for season 2 in 3 weeks. In that time, I will work on the format for the show, update some things in regard to the Patreon, and work with my beautiful rascal of a producer, Rachel, on how we can make this podcast even better. Now, I won't leave you with dead air. There will be placeholder episodes each week. So what I'm doing is introducing an episode of a podcast I really think you should listen to. These are podcasts that I personally listen to that I think you guys might enjoy. So what I'm going to do is do a little intro for that podcast, and then an episode of that podcast will play. So hopefully this introduces you to your, next favorite podcast. And if you fucking hate it, send them hate mail. And I can guarantee you that it will be both educational and inappropriate to keep with the theme here, right? And with that, thank you guys, so much for all the support. This has been a learning exercise for sure, and I can't wait to spend the next 3 weeks really improving this bitch. You can find all our information over at youhavemyswordpodcast.com, and as always, you have my sword. And my warhammer. Bye!
Edgeworks Nebula.